The Caribbean Sea stretches between continents, shaped by shallow shelves and deep channels, warmed by steady currents that move north and west. Its surface often appears calm. Trade winds pass across it with regularity, and for long periods the water holds a consistent color, shifting only with depth and cloud cover. Small islands rise from the sea in scattered chains, many of them low, ringed by reefs that remain unseen until they are close. Shipping routes have crossed these waters for centuries. Cargo vessels, fishing boats, and small private craft move through narrow passages between land and open ocean. Navigation here is familiar, but it is not simple. Reefs lie just below the surface. Weather systems form quickly and without clear boundaries. Storms can develop far from shore and arrive with little warning. At night, the sea offers few reference points. The horizon disappears. Sound carries poorly. Distance becomes difficult to judge. In these conditions, separation from land can happen quietly. There is no single moment when safety ends. The environment changes first, and only later does danger become visible. In late April 1939, a Norwegian sailor named Petter Olaf Pal Nielsen departed the island of St. Croix, then part of the Danish West Indies, aboard a small sailing vessel bound for St. Thomas. The route was short, normally completed within a day under favorable conditions. The sea lane was familiar, used regularly by traders and coastal sailors moving between the islands. Nielsen was in his early 30s. He had spent most of his adult life at sea, working aboard merchant ships in the North Atlantic before settling in the Caribbean. His work included coastal transport, maintenance, and navigation between islands. He was not a passenger. He was responsible for the vessel and its progress. The journey was routine, and no formal crew accompanied him. The boat itself was a modest craft, designed for short regional travel rather than long crossings. It carried basic provisions, navigation tools, and limited fresh water. There was no radio on board. This was not unusual for small vessels operating between nearby islands at the time. Safety depended on weather awareness, seamanship, and the assumption that help was never far away. The Caribbean in April often experiences stable conditions, but seasonal transitions can bring variable winds. On the day Nielsen departed, the sea was unsettled but not extreme. Records from the period indicate shifting winds and passing squalls moving through the Lesser Antilles. These were common features of the region and did not typically prevent travel. Nielsen's background provided him with practical skills rather than specialized survival training. He understood sail handling, basic navigation by compass, and the management of provisions. He was accustomed to working alone for short periods, though extended isolation was not expected on this voyage. The islands he traveled between were visible on clear days. Commercial traffic moved through the area regularly. The purpose of the journey was logistical. Nielsen was transporting supplies and repositioning the vessel. There was no urgency attached to the crossing, and no record of concern before departure. Weather forecasts, as understood at the time, were limited to observation and experience rather than formal reporting. As Nielsen moved away from St. Croix, the island gradually receded. Low land becomes indistinct first, blending into the horizon. The sea opens quickly in this region, and the sense of enclosure provided by land disappears within hours. Under sail, progress depends on wind direction and consistency. Adjustments are frequent but small. At some point during the crossing, weather conditions changed. Wind strength increased, and seas became more uneven. The shift was not violent enough to be immediately dangerous, but it altered the course and speed of the vessel. Navigation required correction, and visibility was reduced intermittently by rain. There is no surviving personal account from Nielsen describing his thoughts or decisions during this period. What is known comes from later reports and maritime records. The voyage continued under deteriorating conditions. The distance between the vessel and known landmarks increased, and the margin for error narrowed. The situation remained outwardly manageable, but the environment was beginning to assert control over the journey. The change from difficulty to disaster did not happen at once. Small sailing vessels rarely fail in a single moment. Control is lost gradually, through accumulation rather than impact. Wind shifts alter heading. Waves interfere with steering. Equipment is strained by forces it was not designed to absorb continuously. At some point after leaving the direct line between St. Croix and St. Thomas, Nielsen's vessel encountered heavier seas. The exact timing is not recorded. What can be established is that the boat was pushed off its intended course and driven farther into open water. Rain reduced visibility. Wind direction made correction difficult. Progress slowed. The critical failure appears to have been navigational rather than structural. There is no evidence of an explosion, collision with another vessel, or immediate hull breach. Instead, the boat was carried toward an uncharted or poorly marked reef system. In the Caribbean, reefs often rise abruptly from deeper water, offering little warning without clear sight lines. The vessel struck submerged coral. The impact was forceful enough to compromise the hull but not violent enough to destroy the boat outright. Water began entering faster than it could be managed. Attempts to free the vessel would have been limited by wave action and the instability of the reef beneath it. Once grounded, the boat was exposed to repeated wave strikes. With each surge, structural damage increased. The mast and rigging became liabilities rather than assets. Eventually, the hull could no longer remain intact. The vessel broke apart over a short period of time. Nielsen survived the initial destruction. How he reached shore is not documented in detail. It is known only that he managed to make landfall on a small, uninhabited island or cay, part of the scattered low-lying formations common in that section of the Caribbean. The island was isolated, with no permanent structures and no regular traffic nearby. What remained of the vessel did not survive intact. Most supplies were lost to the sea. The transition from sailor to castaway occurred without ceremony. There was no signal sent, no confirmed sighting by other ships. The sea resumed its previous state, leaving Nielsen alone on land that offered little indication of where he was or how long he might remain there. The island on which Nielsen came ashore was small and low. Its highest points rose only a few meters above sea level. Vegetation was sparse and shaped by wind. Salt-tolerant shrubs and grasses grew unevenly across sand and exposed rock. There were no fresh streams and no visible signs of human use. The shoreline was irregular, broken by coral fragments and shallow tidal pools. Nielsen's first actions were practical. Survival in such environments depends less on long-term planning than on immediate stabilization. Exposure was the most immediate concern. With no shelter carried ashore from the wreck, he used available materials, branches, sailcloth recovered from debris, and natural rock formations, to reduce direct sun and wind. The shelter was minimal. Its purpose was shade rather than comfort. Fresh water was limited. Rainfall in this part of the Caribbean is irregular, and the island had no natural catchment. Nielsen relied on rainwater collected in improvised containers made from salvaged fragments of the boat and natural depressions in rock. When rain did not fall, water intake dropped sharply. There is no evidence that he found a natural freshwater source. Food procurement became the central daily task. The surrounding reef system provided limited resources. Small fish could be trapped in tidal pools when water receded. Shellfish and crustaceans were gathered by hand. These methods required patience and timing rather than strength. Tools were primitive. Sharp coral fragments and remnants of metal from the wreck were used when available. Fire presented a challenge. Without matches or reliable ignition tools, creating flame was uncertain. Some accounts suggest that Nielsen eventually managed to maintain a small fire using friction and salvaged materials, though the historical record is not fully consistent on this point. If fire was achieved, it would have served multiple purposes: cooking food, reducing parasites, and providing psychological structure to the day. Time on the island was not measured in hours. Without a clock or calendar, days were divided by routine. Morning was used to check tide pools and collect food before heat increased. Midday activity was reduced to conserve energy and water. Evenings were spent maintaining shelter and monitoring the shoreline for passing vessels. Isolation altered perception. The island did not change, but Nielsen's awareness of small variations increased. Wind direction, cloud movement, and wave patterns became signals rather than background. The sound of distant surf differed slightly with tide and weather. These observations were not strategic in a rescue sense, but they helped establish continuity. Physical condition declined gradually. Diet was limited in calories and variety. Weight loss was unavoidable. Minor injuries healed slowly in the humid environment. Saltwater exposure affected skin and eyes. There is no record of serious infection, but the risk was constant. Mental endurance became as important as physical survival. There are no diaries or first-person records describing Nielsen's thoughts. What can be inferred comes from general patterns observed in long-term isolation. Routine reduces cognitive drift. Repetition creates predictability. Tasks, even when small, provide structure. Attempts to signal passing ships were constrained by resources. Smoke, if fire was available, would have been the most effective method. Visual signals using reflective materials were possible but limited by line of sight and traffic density. This region of the Caribbean did not experience continuous maritime traffic, especially near small, unmarked cays. Weeks passed without contact. Weather patterns shifted slightly as the season progressed. Some storms brought rain, briefly improving water availability, but also increased exposure and risk to the fragile shelter. Strong winds forced periods of inactivity, during which energy conservation was critical. The wreckage of the boat became less useful over time. Materials degraded under sun and salt. What could be salvaged was incorporated into shelter or tools early. After that, the island provided little beyond what was already known. There were no new discoveries, only repeated use of limited resources. Health fluctuated. Periods of relative stability were followed by decline when food was scarce or water insufficient. The body adapted to lower intake but at a cost. Strength decreased. Movement slowed. Tasks took longer. Despite these conditions, Nielsen remained alive through sustained effort rather than singular acts of ingenuity. There was no dramatic solution. Survival was achieved through consistency, restraint, and the avoidance of unnecessary risk. The island did not offer escape. It offered only temporary persistence. As the weeks extended into months, the balance that had allowed Nielsen to persist became harder to maintain. The island did not change, but his capacity to respond to it did. Energy reserves were reduced. Recovery from exertion took longer. Tasks that had once been routine required deliberate pacing. Water remained the most limiting factor. Rainfall was inconsistent. When it came, it arrived suddenly and ended without warning. Collection methods were simple and inefficient. Missed opportunities could not be recovered. Periods of dehydration were followed by brief relief. This cycle placed strain on the body and affected concentration. Food availability also fluctuated. Tidal pools did not replenish evenly. Some days yielded small fish or shellfish. Others produced nothing usable. Protein intake was irregular, and there were no sources of carbohydrates beyond minimal plant matter, much of which was inedible or nutritionally insignificant. Weight loss continued steadily. Physical discomfort became constant. Skin exposed to sun and salt showed signs of breakdown. Small cuts from coral and rock healed slowly. Insects were present in limited numbers but added to irritation and sleep disruption. Rest was shallow and frequently interrupted by wind, rain, or changes in temperature after sunset. Isolation intensified psychological pressure. With no external feedback, time became difficult to track. Days blended together. The absence of new stimuli reduced sensory variation. Under such conditions, maintaining routine becomes more difficult but also more necessary. Repetition provided a framework that prevented complete disorientation. There is no record of Nielsen attempting to leave the island using improvised flotation. Given his physical state and the surrounding waters, such an attempt would have carried a high risk of immediate death. Remaining in place, though passive, offered a greater chance of survival. Weather events became more threatening as strength declined. Storms damaged shelter and scattered stored materials. Repairs required effort that was increasingly costly. After severe weather, recovery took days rather than hours. Each event reduced resilience. Despite these setbacks, Nielsen continued to perform essential tasks. He gathered what food he could, maintained minimal shelter, and conserved water. There is no evidence of abandonment or resignation. Survival was not dramatic. It was sustained through continued engagement with immediate needs. The passage of time eventually brought external change. Maritime traffic patterns shifted with seasonal movement. Fishing vessels began operating closer to the region where Nielsen was stranded. This was not something he could influence or predict. It occurred independently of his actions. By the end of the third month, Nielsen's condition was weakened but stable. He remained alive not because circumstances improved, but because they did not deteriorate beyond his capacity to adapt. Survival had become a narrow margin, maintained day by day without assurance of outcome. The end of Nielsen's isolation came without advance notice. There was no gradual approach, no sequence of signals answered over time. A small fishing vessel operating in the region passed within visual range of the island. The crew noticed signs that did not belong to the landscape. Accounts differ on what was seen first, movement, smoke, or the outline of shelter, but attention was drawn long enough for the boat to alter course. When contact was made, Nielsen was alive but visibly weakened. He had been on the island for approximately 3 months. The exact number of days cannot be established with certainty, as he had no means of recording time. His physical condition reflected prolonged undernourishment and dehydration, but he was able to move without assistance. The fishermen provided water and food in controlled amounts. Sudden refeeding was avoided, either by experience or instinct. Nielsen was transported off the island and taken to a nearby inhabited port, likely within the Virgin Islands region. Medical care was limited but sufficient. There are no records indicating long-term injury or illness resulting directly from the ordeal. News of the survival appeared in regional maritime reports. The account was brief. It did not include personal reflection or detailed description. The event was treated as an unusual but contained incident, one of many shipwrecks that occurred in the Caribbean during that period. Nielsen did not become a public figure. There is no evidence that he sought attention or attempted to formalize his experience into narrative. After recovery, he returned to ordinary life. The island remained unmarked and uninhabited. The conditions that had sustained him briefly returned to anonymity. Survival incidents like Nielsen's often leave little physical trace. The island did not change in any permanent way. Shelter materials degraded and returned to the environment. Fire scars, if any existed, were erased by weather. The shoreline continued to receive debris unrelated to the wreck. Within a short time, there was no visible evidence that a person had lived there at all. The historical record preserves only the outline of events. Dates, locations, and outcomes are noted, but interior experience is absent. This absence is not unusual. Many survival cases from the early 20th century were recorded as maritime footnotes rather than human narratives. What mattered to authorities was that a man had gone missing and later been found alive. Details beyond that were considered incidental. What can be observed, without speculation, is the alignment between environment and behavior. Nielsen did not overcome nature. He adjusted to it within narrow limits. The island offered just enough resources to sustain a human body temporarily. Survival depended on recognizing those limits and not exceeding them. There was no single act that ensured his endurance. It was the accumulation of restrained decisions. The case also reflects the conditions of maritime travel at the time. Small vessels operated without communication systems. Routes were familiar but not safeguarded. When accidents occurred, survival depended on proximity to land and the individual's ability to persist without assistance. Rescue was a matter of chance rather than coordination. Nielsen's survival does not carry a lesson in triumph. It demonstrates continuity. Human presence entered a marginal environment, remained briefly, and then left. The sea resumed its patterns. The island remained unused. The shipping routes continued to function without acknowledgement of what had happened nearby. In the historical view, such events do not stand apart. They form a quiet record of how survival has often occurred, without witnesses, without narrative emphasis, and without lasting recognition. What remains is not the experience itself, but the fact that it happened, recorded just enough to confirm that, for a limited time, a person endured where survival was possible but never assured.